The winter air over Ludwigshafen, Germany, hung heavy with smoke on the morning that would alter the course of modern warfare and, eventually, global agriculture. It was January 1911, long before the world would know the names Hitler or Hiroshima. And yet the seeds of two revolutions, one destructive and one life-sustaining, were about to be sown within the same walls. In a sprawling industrial complex owned by BASF, a group of chemists stood quietly around steel cylinders that hissed with a volatile mixture of hydrogen and nitrogen. They were working on a dream that seemed almost impossible, capturing nitrogen from the air and forcing it into a form the human world could use. Among them was a young, intensely focused researcher named Otto. He believed, as many German scientists did, that the nation's future depended on this new world of industrial chemistry. The threat of food shortages, the limits of natural nitrate deposits, and the rising tensions across Europe meant Germany needed a way to produce nitrogen-based materials on its own. Most saw a potential agricultural revolution. Military officers, watching from a distance, saw something else entirely. That morning, the temperature in one of the pressurized reactors began to climb beyond its tolerance. A technician shouted for the cooling valve. Another ran for the emergency lever. For a split second, it looked as if the system might stabilize, but the pressure gauge kept rising. The steel walls vibrated. Everyone in the lab froze, their instincts torn between running and hoping the metal would hold. It didn't. The explosion tore through the laboratory like a thunderclap. A white plume burst upward, carrying sharp fumes that burned the nose and lungs. Windows shattered across the complex. Workers hundreds of meters away felt the shockwave. For a moment, it seemed like a small disaster, another industrial accident, in a rapidly changing world. But within that chaos, a discovery was hiding in plain sight. What had exploded wasn't merely gas under pressure. It was a highly concentrated form of ammonia, created through a combination of temperature, pressure, and catalytic reaction that no one had fully mastered yet. As smoke drifted over the Rhine River, the scientists realized what they had done. They hadn't simply lost a machine. They had proven, violently, that nitrogen from the air could be captured and fixed into a usable compound. The process was dangerous, unstable, and far from perfect, but it worked, and that meant Germany had just unlocked a potential lifeline and a potential weapon. In the years that followed, this discovery formalized as the Haber-Bosch process would allow Germany to produce fertilizing agents on an industrial scale. But it also enabled the mass production of nitrogen-based explosives. The same chemical foundation could feed crops or fuel artillery shells. It could sustain life or take it. No one in that ruined lab could know that this breakthrough, born from fire and panic, would shape both world wars and eventually the world food. The chapter of war had not yet begun, but the chemistry that would drive it was already in motion, forged by accident and destined to alter the future of the planet. The years following the 1911 explosion brought a quiet, almost unsettling transformation to the chemical laboratories of Germany. What had begun as a chaotic accident soon evolved into a structured, meticulously refined system of industrial nitrogen fixation. Fritz Haber, already recognized in scientific circles for his catalytic approach to synthesizing ammonia, became the guiding force behind the operation. His colleague, Karl Bosch, took on the mechanical challenge: how to scale a delicate laboratory miracle into a massive industrial engine. Together, they bridged the worlds of theory and engineering, though neither fully understood the moral contradictions their discovery would unleash. They worked in sealed rooms filled with metallic odors and perpetual tension, aware they were reshaping the future, but unsure of how the world would use their creation. Germany felt the impact almost immediately. With natural nitrate deposits dominated by British control and global political pressure tightening, the new process meant independence. Ammonia flowed from hypersteric reactors day and night, feeding two separate streams of demand. Farmers saw the possibility of richer harvests. Soldiers and strategists saw something more urgent. Nation-states at the dawn of World War I recognized that ammunition shells, bombs, and propellants needed nitrogen as desperately as crops did. The factories at Apo and Luna, born from the Haber-Bosch breakthrough, became industrial fortresses, producing fertilizers in peacetime and essential components for explosives in wartime. Every ton of ammonia synthesized strengthened Germany's position on the global battlefield. making the connection between chemistry and conflict unavoidable. During World War I, this chemical revolution became a lifeline. While maritime blockades cut Germany off from the natural nitrate sources of Chile, the nation continued producing munitions at unprecedented rates. Artillery shells poured from factories faster than they could be fired. The war was horrific, and though historians emphasized trench warfare and machine guns, it was nitrogen odorless, invisible, industrial that kept the German war machine running. Yet even amid destruction, the scientists insisted their work had another purpose. They believed ammonia could prevent famine. They saw fields of wheat fed by their invention. They envisioned a world where nations no longer fought over scarce natural resources. But their dreams were drowned out by the thunder of artillery. When the war finally ended in 1918, Germany lay exhausted, its economy shattered. The chemical plants that had supplied the war effort faced an uncertain future, yet as Europe contemplated peace and recovery, farmers around the globe began to realize what synthetic fertilizer meant. The soil, depleted by decades of overuse, could be reborn. Regions that had struggled with low-yield harvests suddenly had access to nitrogen-rich feeding agents. Haber's and Bosch's invention, once tied to the front lines, found new life in the quiet fields of rural communities. It was a strange irony. The same chemical process that had prolonged a devastating war was now helping rebuild the world. Still, a shadow lingered. Scientists who worked during the conflict understood the duality of their creation. They saw the power it held and the responsibility it demanded. In private letters and public lectures, they spoke cautiously about its potential to be misused. The world listened politely, but the lessons remained fragile. As nations rebuilt and political tensions stirred once more, the factories continued humming. The chemistry had proven too valuable, too transformative, too deeply intertwined with both life and conflict to be ignored. And while the world hoped that the next chapter would bring peace, history was quietly preparing for another war, one where the role of industrial chemistry would become even more complex and By the early 1930s, the world had entered a fragile period between wars. Factories across Germany hummed quietly as the nation attempted to rebuild its identity after the devastation of World War I. Deep inside these industrial complexes, the Haber-Bosch reactors continued producing ammonia at staggering rates. Officially, the output was directed toward agriculture vitalizing fields, restoring breadbasket regions, and helping Germany inch its way out of economic ruin. But beneath the surface, a new political force was rising, one that saw chemistry not as a means to feed people, but as the backbone of a coming military resurgence. Engineers and chemists noticed subtle changes. New military inspectors touring plants, new requests for production reports, and a growing sense that their work was being quietly redirected. When Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, the shift became unmistakable. Although the Treaty of Versailles restricted German rearmament, those limitations were easy to bypass through industrial chemistry. Ammonia, once marketed as a miracle for farmers, flowed into the production of explosives through intermediaries that blurred the line between civilian and military output. Plants like Luna and Oppo expanded rapidly under government incentives. New reactors were built, each capable of producing thousands of tons of nitrogen compounds per year. Workers whispered about special orders, night shifts, and containers that must not be labeled. The pressure inside the factories was no longer just chemical, it was political, ideological, and unrelenting. Meanwhile, Europe looked on with a mix of caution and denial. Diplomats praised Germany's agricultural revival. Economists applauded the country's growing fertilizer exports. But military analysts noticed patterns others ignored. They observed that ammonia production had become disproportionately high for peacetime needs. Reports circulated quietly among Allied intelligence groups, warning that Germany might be using its chemical infrastructure as a concealed rearmament mechanism. Yet no one wanted to believe another war was approaching so soon after the last. The memory of the trenches still haunted the British and French governments, leading them to underestimate the scale and intent behind Germany's industrial preparations. Inside Germany, many scientists faced moral and professional dilemmas. Fritz Hubbard himself, despite having been celebrated as a national hero for his wartime contributions, found his life overturned. WWII was forced from his positions and stripped of his standing in a country he had helped transform. Chemistry had made him powerful, but politics rendered him powerless. He left Germany in sorrow, carrying with him a deep awareness that his invention was no longer under the control of the scientific community. Younger chemists who stayed behind grappled with questions they dared not ask aloud. What was their responsibility in shaping the future? Could they refuse government orders? Would they be complicit if their knowledge contributed to something catastrophic? As the 1930s progressed, Germany's industrial expansion became impossible to ignore. The ammonia plants, operating around the clock, formed the backbone of a new kind of war for one, fought with logistics, resources, and production capacity, long before a single shot was fired. Nations that understood the importance of industrial chemistry began reassessing their own capabilities. Those that underestimated it found themselves falling behind. The world stood on the precipice of another conflict, and peacetime. The fusion of science and state power would ensure that the coming storm was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. By 1939, when German forces invaded Poland, the role of industrial chemistry in rearmament was no longer speculation. It had become the invisible architecture supporting a rapidly expanding war machine. The world had stepped into darkness once again, guided by forces that had quietly evolved inside laboratories, factories, and reactors over decades, an unintended legacy of a discovery born in an accidental explosion so many years before. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the vast network of ammonia and nitrate factories across Germany shifted into a new rhythm, one defined not by agricultural cycles, but by military urgency. Facilities like Luna, Apo, and Die Herrenforth became epicenters of chemical production. Operating around the clock under strict government oversight, workers marched through the gates before dawn, passing under armed guards and blackout shields that prevented Allied pilots from identifying the structures. Inside the plants, the air felt metallic and thick, filled with the droning hum of compressors, pushing gases to pressures that defied intuition. Engineers monitored gauges with trembling focus, knowing that the slightest error could trigger catastrophic explosions. Yet no matter how dangerous the conditions, the demand from Berlin only increased. In the Ministry of Armaments, officials understood that modern warfare required more than steel, and soldiers it required chemistry. Artillery shells consumed nitrogen-based explosives in quantities that far exceeded those of the First World War. Luftwaffe bombs were filled with mixtures derived from ammonia. Even synthetic fuels relied on chemical precursors originating from Haber-Bosch reactors. This meant that Germany's ability to wage war, especially as blockades tightened, depended heavily on the uninterrupted operation of its ammonia plants. Speer, Milch, and other key figures in the Nazi hierarchy pressured plant managers relentlessly, pushing them to expand production regardless of cost or risk. The result was a war fought as much in factories as on battlefields. Within these chemical complexes, the workforce operated under constant strain. Many were skilled technicians, engineers, and chemists who understood the science behind the machines they tended. Others were forced laborers brought from occupied regions, given minimal training and exposed to hazardous conditions. The factories became microcosms of the war itself. Technologically advanced, strategically essential, and morally fraught. Supervisors knew accidents could be fatal. Entire sections of plants had previously been destroyed by runaway reactions, and workers lived with the knowledge that a single mistake could ignite an inferno. Yet they kept the reactors running, driven by fear, obligation, or the hope of survival. As the war intensified, the Allied intelligence community turned its attention to Germany's chemical infrastructure. Reports from resistance networks, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications painted a picture of an industrial system that formed the backbone of German military operations. British analysts at Bletchley Park and American experts in Washington debated how best to disrupt this network. Sabotage missions were considered but deemed too risky. Bombing raids were planned but complicated by the high dispersion of factories. Germany had deliberately spread its chemical production across the country, making it difficult to cripple the entire system with a single strike. This industrial decentralization became one of the reasons the war dragged on longer than many expected. Back in Germany. Chemists who had dedicated their lives to scientific progress wrestled with the consequences of their own expertise. Some tried to distance themselves from the wartime applications of ammonia synthesis, focusing instead on research that might help civilians. Others rationalized their involvement as a necessity in a nation at war. But a number of scientists, both in public and private correspondence, recognized the uncomfortable truth. The tools they had created to feed the world were now fueling destruction on an unimaginable scale. Yet the momentum of war allowed little time for ethical deliberation. The reactors stayed hot, the compressors stayed running, and the factories remained central to Germany's military ambitions. By 1942, the pressure on these industrial leviathans had reached its peak. Production quotas rose, resources dwindled, and the Allies inched closer to striking at the heart of Germany's chemical lifeline. The world was entering the most brutal phase of the conflict, and the chemistry that had once promised abundance now stood at the crossroads between annihilation and survival, its final fate still hidden in the fog of war. By 1943, the Allied leadership had reached a critical conclusion. If Germany, as ammonia and nitrate facilities could be crippled, its ability to sustain a prolonged war would collapse. The factories that had once represented the pinnacle of chemical innovation were now targets, vital organs in the industrial body of the Third Reich. In London, inside dimly lit briefing rooms shielded by blackout curtains, British and American strategists gathered around reconnaissance photographs of sprawling industrial complexes. They studied the thick networks of pipelines, cooling towers, rail links, and storage tanks. Each structure represented a thread in the web of Germany's wartime production. If those threads were cut in the right sequence, the entire system might unravel. One of the most heavily analyzed targets was the Luna Works, an immense chemical complex producing synthetic fuel and nitrogen compounds. Allied planners understood that attacking Luna would not be simple. The plant covered dozens of square kilometers, defended by powerful anti-aircraft batteries and camouflaged under smoke generators meant to obscure targeting. Pilots would have to fly through deadly flak barrages, and even if bombs found their mark, repairing damage might be easier for the Germans than anticipated. Still, the potential payoff was too great to ignore. The United States Army Air Forces prepared a series of massive bombing raids missions that would push crews to the limits of endurance. When the raids began, the skies over central Germany turned into battlefields of their own. Waves of B-17 and B-4 bombers thundered across the horizon, engines trembling under the weight of ordnance. Each formation encountered a gauntlet of flak explosions, black clouds erupting around gunmen. Pilots held their course through turbulence and fear, knowing that behind the steel and smoke below lay the factories that sustained the German war machine. The explosions that followed shook the ground for miles. Firestorms erupted within industrial zones, igniting storage tanks and tearing apart pipelines. But the aftermath was mixed. German emergency crews, many working through the night, managed to restore partial operations within days. The factories were damaged but not destroyed. Meanwhile, inside Germany, plant workers experienced the raids in terrifying proximity. Sirens wailed through chemical corridors as workers scrambled to shut down reactors that could explode if left unattended. Forced laborers, often without shelter, faced the most peril. Even after the bombing ended, the danger remained. Poisonous fumes leaked from ruptured pipes, fires smoldered in underground tunnels, and structural damage threatened to collapse entire sections of the complex. Yet production resumed with grim determination. German authorities regarded chemical output as a national lifeline, and every possible resource was mobilized to keep the reactors running. On the Allied side, frustration grew. Intelligence analysts reported that despite heavy bombing, Germany's ammonia production had remained surprisingly resilient. The redundancy built into the chemical network, multiple plants across different regions, allowed the country to absorb losses. The strategy shifted toward sustained pressure rather than decisive strikes. Bombing raids became more frequent, more concentrated, and increasingly costly. Allied airmen paid a steep price for every mile flown into the heart of Germany's industrial defenses. Still, cracks began to appear. By late 1944, fuel shortages spread across the rail lines transporting nitrates and fertilizer-based explosives were interrupted by air attacks. Chemical plants, once symbols of German industrial superiority, now operated at a fraction of their intended capacity. The process was slow, painful, and far from flawless, but the cumulative effect weakened the very foundation of the Third Reich's military operations. The ammonia reactors that had ignited Germany's industrial rise were beginning to falter under the relentless weight of Allied strategy, setting the stage for a dramatic unraveling that would soon reshape both the war and the world that followed. By early 1945, the once mighty chemical infrastructure that had fueled Germany's war machine was crumbling under the relentless weight of Allied pressure. The Luna Works, previously one of the most formidable industrial complexes in Europe, now operated at a fraction of its intended capacity. Storage tanks lay twisted from repeated bombing. Pipelines were severed in dozens of places, and the constant hum of high-pressure compressors had been replaced by intermittent sputters and the eerie silence of machines starved of power. Engineers walked through ruble-strewn corridors with notebooks pressed to their chests, documenting damages that no repair crew could address quickly enough. What had once been a symbol of German self-sufficiency was becoming a graveyard of collapsed scaffolding, scorched steel, and exhausted workers. Inside the battered factories, the atmosphere felt heavier with each passing week. Air raid sirens had become so routine that workers hardly flinched when they sounded. Instead, they focused on salvaging whatever remained operational. A pump that still functioned despite a cracked housing, a reactor vessel that hadn't ruptured, a cooling line patched together with improvised welding. Managers received orders from Berlin demanding increased output, but these directives felt detached from reality. Raw materials were scarce, transportation networks were failing, and the skilled workforce had been decimated by conscription and casualties. Even the most experienced technicians knew they were fighting a losing battle against physics, logistics, and time. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence tracked the decline with growing confidence. Aerial photographs showed widening scars across Germany's chemical belt. Reconnaissance pilots reported plants that no longer emitted the characteristic white plumes of ammonia processing. Analysts in London noted dramatic drops in synthetic fuel production critical for Luftwaffe. Operations and estimated that nitrogen-based explosives were reaching dangerously low reserves. Every disrupted railway, every damaged pipeline, and every inoperable compressor contributed to Germany's shrinking ability to sustain its armies. The industrial attrition had reached a tipping point, and the consequences rippled through every front line. For the workers inside these failing factories, the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Many had spent decades building and maintaining the very technology that now lay in ruins. Some felt relief, believing that the collapse of chemical production might hasten the end of a war they no longer supported. Others felt guilt, haunted by the realization that their expertise had been used for destructive purposes. Letters written during this period speak of fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty in entire generation of chemists and engineers caught between duty, survival, and moral unease. They watched as once familiar hallways filled with dust and debris, unsure whether they were witnessing the end of a facility or the end of an era. As the front lines closed in, German officials issued messages urging factories to continue operating at all costs. But those costs were already too high. Equipment failed faster than it could be repaired. Allied bombing had severed power lines, leaving entire sections of plants frozen in silence. Forced laborers, now abandoned by fleeing guards in some regions, wandered through the ruins seeking shelter. The infrastructure that had once supported Germany's wartime ambitions had reached its breaking point. By April 1945, with Allied troops crossing into central Germany, the final blow came not from bombs, but from occupation. American and British forces took control of chemical plants that had defined the previous decade of conflict. What they found were hollow shells of industrial giants, machinery contorted by heat and pressure, laboratories buried under rubble, and warehouses filled with unfinished materials. The war was nearing its end, and with it, the shadow cast by Germany's vast chemical empire began to fade. Yet hidden within the wreckage was a paradox, waiting to be rediscovered, one that would soon transform destruction into nourishment for the post-war world. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe found itself staring at landscapes of ruined cities reduced to ash, factories twisted into steel skeletons, and fields abandoned after years of war. Amid the devastation, Allied soldiers and scientists moving through the newly occupied German territories encountered an unexpected sight inside the shattered chemical plants. Vast stockpiles of ammonia-based compounds, partially processed materials, and dormant reactors that had once powered the Third Reich's explosives industry. What had been designed to feed artillery shells, torpedoes, and bombs now lay inert, stripped of purpose. Yet within this wreckage, Allied experts recognized an extraordinary opportunity, one that would shape the recovery not only of Germany, but of the entire world. In makeshift command rooms set up inside abandoned offices, American agricultural and chemical specialists gathered around chalkboards filled with hastily drawn formulas. They understood that the Haber-Bosch process, though weaponized during the war, held potential far beyond conflict. The same ammonia used to create nitrogen-based explosives could be converted into fertilizer more efficiently than anything previously known. In war, this chemistry had enabled destruction. In peace, it could feed nations emerging from famine and scarcity. The irony was not lost on anyone. Scientists debated how best to repurpose the equipment without violating safety protocols or risking contamination from wartime residues. The stakes were higher-up faced food shortages so severe that entire populations risked starvation if crop yields failed, as military administrators oversaw the dissolution of Germany's chemical war infrastructure. They also preserved key components of the ammonia reactors, recognizing their value. Engineers who had once maintained these machines for wartime use now found themselves assisting Allied reconstruction teams. It was a strange reversal. Individuals who had spent years under pressure to support the German war machine were suddenly asked to help rebuild a continent. Many welcomed the shift. The moral weight of their wartime work hung heavily on them, and contributing to agriculture felt like a path toward redemption. They repaired compressors, recalibrated gauges, and taught Allied technicians how to operate the machinery safely, all while wrestling with the complicated legacy of their profession. Across Europe, demand for fertilizers surged. Fields lay barren after years without proper cultivation, and food supplies were dangerously low. Nations depended on chemical solutions to revive agriculture quickly. In this moment, the ammonia stored in Germany's ruined industrial centers became a lifeline. Trains transported repurposed nitrogen compounds across regions struggling to replant crops. Farmers who had lost everything, livestock, tools, even their homes, found hope in the white granules that promised renewed harvests. The transformation from war material to agricultural fertilizer was not merely symbolic. It was a practical necessity that helped prevent mass hunger during the fragile post-war period. Meanwhile, in the United States, scientists and policymakers took note of the ammonia reactor's astonishing efficiency. They understood that global agriculture would never be the same. The war had demonstrated the scale at which nitrogen fixation could be industrialized. Now, with peace restored, nations had both the knowledge and the urgency to implement it worldwide. What began in German laboratories decades earlier and had fueled to world wars was poised to become the foundation of the 20th century's agricultural revolution. It was a shift so profound that few could fully grasp its long-term implications. By 1946, the world stood at the beginning of a transformation as dramatic as any battlefield victory. The chemistry that had once given armies the means to destroy was now giving farmers the means to rebuild. The paradox was complete. The same nitrogen compounds that had kept Germany fighting long after its resources should have collapsed were helping feed millions across a shattered continent. Yet the story was far from over. The global consequences of this scientific repurposing, economic, environmental, and political war just starting to unfold, setting the stage for a new chapter in humanity's relationship with war, science, and survival. In the years immediately following the war, the world faced a humanitarian crisis on a scale rarely acknowledged in history books. Entire regions of Europe and Asia hovered on the brink of famine. Cities had no functioning supply chains, farmland lay scarred by tank tracks and bomb craters, and millions of displaced civilians depended on uncertain food rations. Against this bleak backdrop, scientists, policymakers, and military administrators urgently searched for solutions. One answer rose from the rubble of wartime chemistry. Industrial nitrogen fixation, the same process that had once allowed nations to produce explosives during global conflict, could now rescue fragile societies struggling to feed themselves. It was a remarkable reversal, one that carried both hope and deep moral reflection. As reconstruction began in earnest, Allied agricultural experts recognized the unprecedented opportunity hidden within the German chemical complexes they now controlled. These facilities had produced ammonia on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the world. With modifications, their reactors could be converted to produce vast quantities of fertilizer. American and British engineers worked alongside German technicians, many of whom were relieved to apply their skills to peaceful purposes, recalibrating equipment and adapting production lines. The transformation required ingenuity. Machinery designed for high-energy wartime compounds had to be fine-tuned for agricultural purity, and safety protocols had to be rewritten to avoid contamination. Yet progress came swiftly. Wheat in Mons ammonia, that once fed the explosives industry, was being packaged for shipment to rural communities desperate for renewal. In Europe, the effects were immediate and profound. Nations ravaged by conflict saw their agricultural yields rise dramatically. The Marshall Plan supported fertilizer distribution as a key pillar of economic recovery, emphasizing that food stability was essential for political stability. For farmers, many of whom had watched their fields fall into neglect during years of occupation or battle, the new synthetic fertilizers felt almost miraculous. Crops sprouted in soils that had long been exhausted. Wheat and barley returned to regions where harvests had failed repeatedly during the war. What had once symbolized devastation became a symbol of rebirth. It was a transformation that touched not only the physical land, but the emotional landscape of post-war societies yearning for normalcy. Across the Atlantic, the United States observed these developments with strategic interest. American policymakers foresaw that global agriculture would never again rely solely on natural nitrogen cycles. Industrial chemistry had entered a new era, and the Haber-Bosch process born. In a laboratory accident and refined through decades of conflict, was becoming a cornerstone of global food production. Research institutions began expanding their agricultural programs, studying how nitrogen fertilizers could boost yields not only in Europe, but in developing nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The implications were enormous. If applied broadly, synthetic fertilizer could alleviate food shortages on a global scale, reduce dependency on limited natural resources, and stabilize regions vulnerable to political unrest. Yet alongside the optimism, scientists quietly debated the long-term consequences of such dependence. Despite the hope it offered, this new agricultural revolution was not without ethical weight. Historians, engineers, and former wartime chemists grappled with a troubling truth. The world's growing ability to feed itself came directly from technologies that had caused immense suffering. The line between destruction and nourishment had never been thinner. Many post-war scientists wrote about this irony, acknowledging that their fields of expertise carried a dual legacy. The same nitrogen compounds that had empowered armies to wage prolonged conflict were now empowering farmers to produce record harvests. The paradox lingered in scientific journals, policy debates, and personal reflections. Could humanity fully embrace the benefits of this technology while remaining vigilant against its dark potential? By the late 1940s, the transformation was undeniable. A world once torn apart by scarcity and war had discovered, almost by accident, a new means of survival. The chemical processes developed under the pressures of global conflict were now shaping peacetime prosperity. Fields that had witnessed the march of armies now glowed golden with wheat. Nations ravaged by destruction were producing enough food to feed themselves and export to others. Yet this rapid shift also raised new questions about sustainability, dependency, and the future balance between science and society. The chapter of wartime chemistry had given way to a chapter of agricultural abundance, but the story was still unfolding, driven by the same force that had changed the course of the 20th century. Nitrogen pulled from the air and harnessed by human hands. By the early 1950s, the quiet revolution sparked by wartime chemistry had spread far beyond Europe's rebuilding efforts. Industrial nitrogen fixation, initially developed under scientific curiosity, weaponized under totalitarian regimes, and finally repurposed under Allied reconstruction, was now reshaping the entire global food system. Nations recovering from decades of colonial exploitation, poverty, and war saw synthetic fertilizer not merely as a scientific tool, but as a lifeline. International organizations, including the newly formed FIA, praised nitrogen fertilizers as one of the most important technological breakthroughs of the century. Yet behind the optimism lay a complex web of geopolitical consequences that few could fully foresee. The world was entering a new era, and nitrogen would define its trajectory. In Asia, the effects were dramatic and immediate. Countries such as Japan and South Korea, still reeling from wartime devastation and facing acute food shortages, embraced synthetic fertilizers to accelerate national recovery. Japanese agronomists rebuilt farming cooperatives around the Haber-Bosch miracle, transforming small rice fields into high-yield engines of national rebirth. South Korean scientists, supported by American aid programs, introduced nitrogen-rich fertilizers into regions devastated by conflict, stabilizing food production during the uncertain aftermath of the Korean War. In both nations, the chemistry once associated with destruction had become the foundation for economic resurgence. Fields that had witnessed the passage of armies were now producing enough grain to sustain entire populations in India, Pakistan, and other developing nations. The introduction of synthetic fertilizer would soon contribute to what historians now call the Green Revolution. Agricultural yields soared in regions that had long battled low productivity and recurring famine. American scientists, such as Norman Borlaug, championed high-yield crops grown with nitrogen supplementation, laying the groundwork for unprecedented improvements in global food security. The link between wartime chemistry and peacetime prosperity was no longer a historical irony. It was a defining characteristic of the post-war world. Yet even as these successes unfolded, scientists and policymakers debated the long-term implications. Could the world sustain this newfound reliance on industrial nitrogen? Would environmental consequences emerge in the future? These questions lingered like shadows over an otherwise triumphant narrative. Meanwhile, in the United States, industrial-scale fertilizer production became a cornerstone of the nation's agricultural dominance. American farmers, benefiting from large, fertile fields and rapidly mechanizing agricultural practices, embraced synthetic nitrogen as a key to achieving record-breaking harvests. Corn, wheat, and soybean production expanded dramatically, reshaping the economy of the Midwest. Companies that had once supplied chemical components for wartime manufacturing now produced fertilizers for civilian use, symbolizing the broader shift from military to agricultural industry. The transformation demonstrated how technologies born in conflict could, under different circumstances, drive unprecedented growth and stability. Still, not all consequences were unambiguously positive. Environmental scientists began observing subtle changes: nutrient runoff into rivers, algal blooms in coastal waters, and concerns about soil dependency on chemical inputs. These issues were small and largely overlooked in the post-war enthusiasm, but they hinted at challenges the world would confront decades later. Some former wartime chemists, now working in universities, wrote cautiously about the risks of overusing synthetic fertilizers. They recognized the delicate balance between feeding a growing world and safeguarding the natural ecosystems that supported it. Their warnings were often overshadowed by the global hunger crisis, but they planted the seeds of discussions that would only gain prominence generations later. By the mid-20th century, nitrogen had become a global force, one that transcended borders, ideologies, and the dividing lines of the Cold War. Whether in American wheat fields, Japanese rice paddies, or Indian experimental farms, the chemical legacy of the world wars now shaped the rhythms of everyday life. The paradox at the core of this transformation, war-driven innovation becoming the engine of peace, remained both awe-inspiring and unsettling. As the world approached a new era of technological expansion, the question that lingered was whether humanity could continue wielding this powerful tool responsibly. The final chapter of this story would reveal how the balance between science, survival, and consequence would define the centuries to come. By the late 20th century, humanity found itself living in a world profoundly shaped by the chemical breakthroughs born in the early 1900s and transformed through two global conflicts. Synthetic nitrogen had become so common that few people gave it a second thought. Bags of fertilizer stacked in hardware stores, golden fields stretching across continents, and the stability of global food markets all trace their origins to the same chemical process that once powered artillery shells and aerial bombs. Historians looking back at this century-long journey saw it as one of the most consequential transformations in human history. It was a story of invention, destruction, renewal, and ultimately survival arc that revealed how deeply intertwined war and peace had become in shaping modern life. As scientists continued refining the chemical processes behind nitrogen fixation, they also acknowledged the moral complexities at its core. Post-war generations of chemists debated the legacy of Fritz Haber, Karl Bosch, and the industrial systems they created. Haber's personal story, marked by brilliance, tragedy, and exile, became emblematic of the dual nature of scientific achievement. The same mind that helped Germany produce wartime explosives had also enabled the agricultural revolution that fed billions. Bosch's engineering marvels, originally intended to give Germany independence during wartime blockades, had become the backbone of global food security. Their work demonstrated that scientific discoveries could not be separated from the political and social contexts in which they were used. Each new advance required ethical reflection, a lesson as relevant today as it was in the aftermath of the world wars. Meanwhile, the global population surged. By the dawn of the 21st century, synthetic fertilizers were responsible for sustaining nearly half of the world's food production. Entire nations depended on nitrogen-rich compounds to feed their people, creating a new kind of geopolitical landscape. Fertilizer factories became strategic assets. International trade routes shifted. Countries that lacked access to these technologies faced vulnerabilities that went far beyond simple economics. In this new reality, the legacy of wartime chemistry could be felt in every grain of rice, every loaf of bread, and every harvest pulled from one's barren soil. Humanity had embraced a tool that promised abundance but demanded responsibility. At the same time, environmental scientists raised concerns that echoed earlier warnings. Nitrogen runoff contributed to water pollution. Over-fertilization threatened soil health. Ecosystems struggled under the weight of agricultural expansion. Policymakers realized that the world's reliance on synthetic nitrogen had created both stability and fragility. Efforts to develop more sustainable practices gained momentum, reflecting a growing understanding that the lessons of the 20th century could not be repeated. Just as wartime innovation had been repurposed for peace, modern society needed to repurpose the tools of abundance for long-term balance. The future required not only technological progress, but wisdom born of history. Yet, despite these challenges, the central truth remained unchanged. Humanity had survived the tumultuous 20th century in part because of nitrogen pulled from thin air. What began as a dangerous laboratory experiment, refined through decades of conflict, became the foundation of a global food system. The transformation was unprecedented in human history, a shift that allowed billions to live lives their ancestors could scarcely imagine.